Hey, all you folks on Zoom, we have new technology we're running tonight in tandem with the Zoom. So anyone that wants to get in the future can just log into positionofneutrality.org, and this will stream live through that, but you won't have to go through passwords and gateways. This allows us to get into secure environments and do a number of other things. So those of you that if you don't catch it on the Zoom, you can come in live, and if you miss that thing, it'll get recorded and it'll be libraried there on the site, positionofneutrality.org. So you know, everyone that's on, because I know a lot of you from different parts of the country, and I don't know any other way to get you that information. And we're about at 7 o'clock now. So if we're ready, the 7 o'clock meeting is rumored to start at 7 o'clock. So I don't know how many of you are first time, anyone here for the very first time at a big book study of this nature done here? Okay. So first of all, welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we do so you know what to expect. What we do here is we take a look at the suggested instruction for a step or so a week directly out of this book. And we use this book in 12-Step Recovery. Why? The process described by the authors of this book has been proven to work for addicts of the hopeless variety, addicts to alcohol and other substances. So what I do here is not tell you what the book says, because what the book says to you is none of my business, but I'll show you how I find it says to me. And I'll encourage you to have your experience, and if we both do our job, we'll share a spiritual experience in this room or on that Zoom tonight. How many of you have been here before and can witness for folks that happens? So if you were here in the room, you'd see a bunch of people raising their hand. If you could see the Zoom screen, you'd see some other raising their hand. But the fact is, people can connect to the Spirit when they get a spirit of revelation, when they learn how to find their experience in this book. You'll feel it with this sensory power that we call God. And when you feel it, I'll call it to your attention. And there's a little thing in the book that said there's one who has all power, that one is. Right, so when that happens and we all experience it, then we're experiencing that power that we're going to improve consciousness of. Fair enough? And so tonight we're in step 1, so some of the experience we're going to have tonight is going to suck. Because that's the nature of the step 1 experience, right? I mean, if you come out of an experience of powerlessness and unmanageability and it's all, unicorns and rainbows, you miss something, right? So what we want to do is go to the book initially to the forward to the first edition, which you'll find on Roman numeral 13, XIII. And that's the forward to the first edition of the book, published in 1939. And we're going to show you why we do this particular session the way we do it. It says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. So notice how it didn't say to tell others. It said to show. And they told you that the first men and women recovered. Any of you have been around long enough to hear the arguments of whether we recover or we're always recovering? It's not an argument, it's a different of an experience, because there was no disease that was acknowledged by medical science at the time the book was written, so they obviously were talking about a mining term, not a medical term. If you look up the dictionary, recovered in a mining sense is to take from what was thought waste and extract something infinitely valuable. How many of you felt like maybe you wasted your life? And you found out that your experience was uniquely useful to help other people save their life. Found out that what you thought was waste, some from that was extracted something of extreme value. Well, that's what it is to be recovered. So it's not an argument. Some people just haven't had the experience. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to run from there. It says, for them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experiences will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. So I'm going to jump from there to something else that I want you to understand about fellowship versus program. And people hear me say it, and they think I'm anti-fellowship, and I'm not. I just think a fellowship that calls itself the program has killed more people than the drug has. Because the fellowship's not the program. And if we just told people that there's a fellowship and you're all welcome here, and there's a program, if you honestly want to and are willing to make the effort, which will free you from those limiting thoughts about yourself. I don't think that's a hard message to deliver, but we'd have to know that was true in order to deliver it. So I want to show you a little something about what the authors did, because a lot of people don't know that the fellowship was named after the book, not the other way around. They didn't form a fellowship and then write a book about it. They wrote a program describing precisely how they recovered and then formed a fellowship around it. And people say, Joe, you might be making that up. So I want to show you where you can find that fact. Go to page XVII in the forward of the second edition. And there, about 3 paragraphs down, it says, it was now time the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. Which volume? The book, right? The second edition of the book. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. So when people say, well, I've never heard that. I've been sober for 33 years. I never heard that. Well, then you never read your fucking book. Kind of cool, right? You can be a dick and still save lives. Okay. Let's carry on. So let's go to a little bit further in the book. Let's look at the doctor's opinion, and let's take a look at first. Let's look at XXVII, Roman numeral 27. And I want to jump down to the last sentence on the page. It says, of course, an alcoholic ought to be freed from his physical craving for liquor. A lot of times we talk about the mental condition of the addict, but we don't talk about the physical condition that causes this dilemma to be so baffling. How many of you found that when you ingested alcohol, it tended to energize you? So what was meant to sedate you, this abnormal effect caused you to do more than your fellows, and it was seemingly impossible to stop because you didn't feel sedated even when you were acting sedated. And this often requires a definite hospital procedure before psychological measures can be of maximum benefit. So, of course, they're going to detox me before they can work with me so that they can get me to accept this that they're offering, because I cannot move into a conscious relation without conscious participation. Does that make sense? So it's better if we're sober physically before this is presented to us, but it's not absolutely necessary. It's just better. Before we're over tonight, we'll see that the main writer of this book was not sober when he was first presented with it, and yet we're all here. Kind of interesting. So it says, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. So he's told us what it looks like, and now he's telling us in medical terms that he doesn't really understand this phenomenon, but alcoholics seem to have an abnormal reaction to the sedative alcohol. Where are my opiate addicts? Did you notice how when you were using, you were doing okay, although you should have been heavily sedated? And when you were out, everyone thought you were on shit again, because that's an abnormal reaction. Where's my meth heads? I've watched you cats slam it and not out. Am I lying? Where are you guys? So this allergy that we make jokes about is deadly serious, because if you don't own that, we cannot fully concede to our innermost self based on a lie. So it's not about I do this and I break out in handcuffs. That's very clever, but it doesn't allow me to internalize the fact that when I drink, the reason I always overshoot the mark is it doesn't do to them what it does to me. It's not a theory. I've had them tell me. The phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. So have you ever ingested alcohol or whatever you chased in here and found you did more than you set out to? Well, that means you're not an average temperate drinker or user. So if you were hoping to be a moderate heroin addict, cross that one off. That make sense? They didn't tell us we were an addict yet, but we have eliminated moderate. Okay? These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. Is that me screwing up the mic? And once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. We might not have used those words, but is that not kind of what happened? Astonishingly difficult to solve, right? So if that's so, we're going to look into it. How many of you have put the stuff in your body and sometimes you were able to use it in precise quantities you wanted to? So then you're thinking, well, maybe I'm not an alcoholic. So we got one more question for you. Did you know when that was going to happen? So did you ever really have control? You still might be. Because the mind will lie. Doesn't happen every time. Okay. Do you know when it's going to happen? No. Okay. Is it safe? Okay. So then it goes on to talk a little bit more about frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. How many of you have endured lots of frothy emotional appeal? Did it work? The message which can interest and hold these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. Guys, I want you to understand, it isn't about me shocking you with the horrendous life of Joe. It is to tell you of the miraculous healing that Joe experienced from the inside when everything outside was dead. That's got depth and weight. How many of you felt it? Because some of you did. That didn't come from up here, that happened within you. That's what they mean by depth and weight. Entertainment is one thing, but reclamation's a whole different gig. Right? So we're going to have to bear witness to the power and not the miracles of Joe. You understand? If I'm telling you about the miracles of Joe, some portion of it is embellished. In nearly all cases, their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their lives. So a lot of people say, well, I don't want to believe in a power greater than myself. And I say, what are you doing in a 12-step room then? Because if heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, alcohol is not a power greater than you, then go forth and use moderately. But if any of those are a power greater than you, then you already believe. You're just believing in a synthetic spirit. And we want you to know there's a spirit that is not synthetic. Okay? So I'm going to do, have most of you all been to treatments before of some sort? Okay? So we've been through the therapeutic model. How many of you found you went through numerous therapeutic models and yet still had to come buy a $10 big book? So we're going to go through, because we respond better to stories, we're going to go through Bill's story instead of the therapeutic model much further, if that's all right. Okay, so I'm going to go to let's go to page 5, and we're in the middle of Bill's story. And Bill says, liquor ceased to be a luxury, it became a necessity. How many of you can recall That time, not so much that other people knew, but when you finally knew that I'm not doing this because I want to. I have to do this. In fact, there's days I don't even want to do it, but ain't nothing else happening unless I do it. Any of you ever get there? So what he's going to describe it for him, but I want you to see your own, because this is about arming you with the facts about you, not arming you with the facts about some guy back then, right? So what he says is bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3 got to be routine. How many of you saw a progression? So what used to work didn't work. So you added, better living through chemistry. Okay. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I'd pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. Any of you relate to waking up early, shaking violently, not really wanting to be up? But what I need to do and what I want to do are no longer in alignment. A tumbler full of gin followed by a half dozen bottles of beer would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. So he's telling about what it looked like for him. Most of you can paint in your mind your own story, how sick you had to be, and you still had to do a bump to try and get well enough to go get more before you got sicker. Yeah? Okay. Now here's the thought of the addict. See if you relate to this, because this is the place in the whole story where you all might catch addiction. If you got them spooked now. So we all admitted, if we're in this class, that we remember that time when we're, oh shit, if I don't put a little in me, I won't be well enough to go get more, and I'm going to run out, and then I'm really going to be sick. Okay, so we're there. Oh, this is a shared experience. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation. How many of you, all outside evidence would suggest you're really in trouble, and you're like, I got this shit. Got it? That's where you just caught addiction. Because you should not relate to that if you're a temperate heroin user. And there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Gradually, things got worse. So think about the way we minimize, because that's what he's talking about. He's thinking about how he's minimizing it. And he's going to tell you what gradually looks like and see if you relate to him. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. Anyone relate? Sometimes that's just getting evicted. But, sometimes we had a house to take away. Other times it was just a lease agreement. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father became ill. How many of you missed some of those events in your life? Unable to be present? Did it make for more drinking and using? Yeah, that's an unhappy time, isn't it? Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point of 1932, and I somehow formed a group to buy. You ever in the midst of your disease get an opportunity? Was it encouraging? Yeah, man. I was to share generously in the profits. Any of you start counting that big money that was coming? What happened? Did you go out to celebrate that big money you didn't quite have? Then I went on a prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. So I know they use colorful words, but most of us can relate to it all these years later, right? I went and spent the money I know I'm going to get tomorrow, because after all, I'm going to have it tomorrow. But then tomorrow's passed without my notice, because I'm still in yesterday. Yeah? So then he comes to, as many of us have, I woke up. This had to be stopped. How many of you concluded that? What was the outcome of that conclusion? Perhaps I overreacted, right? This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. Any of you make that promise? How many times? Can't count them, right? Before then I had written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. Did you have anyone whose life you were co-wrecking? Some of us had numerous ones, right? And we shared our discovery, not even one. Yeah. And then they were in agreement with us. Wow, that's really good. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk. That's a bummer. I hope she's not easily disappointed, right? There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? So now he's asking himself the questions. When we find our experience in here, we want to use those question marks to go inward, recalling that experience. What had happened? Where I knew it wasn't safe. I knew I couldn't do it. I knew I didn't want to wreck everything. Where did that go when I encountered an opportunity? Right? See how you felt that you go right back to the powerlessness. See, that's a shared experience too. It's not a theory. Powerless is not a theory. So he says, I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone had pushed a drink my way and I had taken it. Was I crazy? We say that glibly, though. When we are crazy and everyone knows we're crazy, we say things like, what, do you think I'm crazy? But everyone but us knows, yeah. We're hoping that's all it is, right? I began to wonder for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. So Bill's telling you what the insanity of addiction is. It's an appalling lack of perspective. I'm believing that whatever it is I've created for my life is worth cashing in this moment to feel different in this moment or to not. Yeah? Any of you ever done that? Cash that check? Renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. How many of you have had that bump in and out? So what he's talking about is when I confuse the experience of grace with the illusion of control. I go from, I don't know how this happened, to, I got this. When I never had it. Somehow I got a reprieve in time to survey my life and see if I needed to do something different, and I rejected what was laid before me and just didn't pick up no matter what until I did. Any of you had that experience? So then it says what happened after that is I could laugh at the Jen Mills. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone, and no time at all I was beating on the bar asking myself how it happened. Any of you relate to just running into somebody? Offer you a little something? Doesn't even give it a passing thought, even though you had a high resolve. And then once it's in you, what do you think? Might as well get high now. Fix it later, right? So what Bill says is, as the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I'd manage better next time, but I might as well get good and drunk then. And I did. See how he still has the delusion of control? He still thinks that he wasn't insane before he took that drink. Knowing what he knew was likely to happen as a result of taking that drink, he did it because he had an appalling lack of perspective of what was going to happen after. And then after, he convinced himself, I'm behaving as I would like to behave. What these guys discovered is the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. For reasons yet obscure, he's lost the power of choice in drink. Right? And they go into, we cannot bring to consciousness with sufficient force the memory of suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. That's what he's describing there. How many of you had that happen? So it's not about memory. I came into a fellowship where they told you, remember your last drink or you haven't had it yet. Well, I remember the last one and the one before that and the one before that, and I'm still fucked up like Hogan's goat. Now what? But if I had read this book, they'd have told me memory wasn't going to work. It's consciousness. Awareness of being aware is what works. Make sense? Okay. So now he's going to talk about what happened after he decided to get drunk. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. How many of you knew it wasn't safe, not going to do it no matter what, told a few people you're not going to do it no matter what, then you did it? How many of you can recall the remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next day? And you ain't lying. It's unforgettable. I just felt the energy go down. Did the rest of you feel that? Because when we bring to consciousness, we know that's a shared experience. That's a revelatory spirit trying to help you know that powerlessness is not where we operate. But it is something that we're familiar with, and those of us who have gained access to power don't like to stay there for even a moment. Okay, the courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. A morning paper told me that the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. How many of you can go with him on that deal? Like, life looks like it's going on, but it's going on without me. If I don't try again, I can't fail again. Any of those similar thoughts? That's the experience of hopelessness that powerless engenders. Powerlessness is not a state we operate well in because we've gained access to power. But we all recognize powerlessness when we confront it because we feel it. It's a drain. But that's an opportunity to share power. Does it make sense? That's what we do, depth and weight. We wouldn't have encountered anybody. God wouldn't have put you in front of me without the power to carry that out. There's an introduction indicated. Yes? Okay. Well, so would I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. It is a hard thought, isn't it? Should I kill myself? How many of you went there? Judging from the hands up, apparently that thought passed or it was unsuccessful. Not trying to make light, but most of us have had that thought. Some of us have taken action, but we're all here. So thankfully, we can move on, but we can have that shared experience, yeah? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that, so 2 bottles in oblivion. See, I've heard people for years tell me, well, alcohol stopped working for me. And I read in Bill, see, it never stopped working for me. It always did what it intended. It just, I didn't feel that much better as a result. I felt different. But at a point, since I didn't know there was anything else, I was more like Bill. I'm going to drink myself out of consciousness because the consciousness of my intolerable situation is unbearable. Yeah? So the mind and body are marvelous mechanisms. For mine endured this agony 2 more years. How many of you were in the throes of addiction for a long time, and a lot of people gave up on you, and you gave up on you? And then one day, something was different? So we want to read more in the book because we're still back in that place. How many of you working with people watch people come back and pick up a 24-hour chip over and over, and you get frustrated with them? But that's who we are, man. That's who we are. That's who our author was. That's who we are. So we don't want to talk to somebody who doesn't know the experience or is blind to the experience. We want to talk to these guys who encountered this power, who restored their lives, right? Okay. So I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me, and again I swayed dizzily before an open window or the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish, I feared I would burst through my window sash and all. Any of you drink to delirium tremens? Those of us that have, not most people do anymore, but because someone arrests us or whatever. But if you're drinking very heavily, and that's why they put you in detox, if you're drinking very heavily and you're super saturated, one of the conditions is, you just go into this period of hallucination and accelerated heartbeat, and it's very, very dangerous. And the reason these teeth are here is because one time in delirium tremens, I cut my teeth out with a commando knife because I thought that I had strings coming out of my mouth that were choking me. That's what happens to people in delirium. Okay, so somehow I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor lest I suddenly leap. A doctor came with a heavy sedative. How many of you were so grateful for that doctor with the heavy sedative? Came to rely upon it, right? What happened after you got the heavy set? We had to go to him after a while. Back then they came to you. Now they make us drive to the hospital in our condition. Any of you ever drive to the detox? Can you help me park my car? I don't think it's safe. Next day found me drinking both gin and sedative. You relate to him? This combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity. So did I. So now he's in agreement. Now it's not a joke anymore. You remember when it wasn't a joke anymore? Remember when you thought addict or alcoholic was like a title? And then all of a sudden, it was a condition? When it moved from here to here? That's what he's talking about. Who's feeling that? I could eat little or nothing when drinking. I was 40 pounds underweight. My brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I'd been seriously ill bodily and mentally. We often read right past that, but how many of you felt really foolish and degraded because of the way you'd behaved? You'd let yourself down, you'd let everybody down, and you felt somehow you'd let the medical professionals down. And sometimes they agreed with us because doctors don't believe us. But he got some good news. He had been seriously ill bodily and mentally. So I don't drink alcoholically by choice. I'm alcoholic by nature, so it's the only way I can drink. Therefore, it is not safe to drink because I have this abnormal reaction. I need to be fed by the Spirit, but I don't do well on synthetic spirits. Hence my dilemma. Any of you find yourself in a similar dilemma? All right, then. Let's read further. It relieved me somewhat to know that in alcoholics, the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor. How many of you were relieved that you weren't necessarily bad, that you were ill? And you could live with that and try and sort it out. Okay, that's what he got told. Though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. How many of you had a desperate desire to stop? Could express no outwardly action to prove it to anyone else. So you can understand now the dilemma isn't just out there, the dilemma is in here. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. How many of you got a better understanding of yourself and fared forth in high hope? We probably wouldn't say it that way, right? But I got out and was encouraged, yes? As opposed to got out and knowing I was going to go get hooked up. How many of you went to detoxes because you couldn't get it brought to you? You knew as soon as you got out where you were going, you just went and got hooked up. Some of us do that. But that was, one along many. But there were other times when I left knowing that I had experienced the cure. Because I understood me. It's a lie, but that's what I believed. Any of you? Okay. So he says, for 3 or 4 months, the goose hung high. That's a weird expression. But what it really means is things were looking up. If the goose is up higher, I'm going to have to look up to see the goose. So how many of you got 30-day, 60-day, right on the cusp of 90? Okay. It's confusing, isn't it? I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. Now he's going to tell us a little story about that self-knowledge, but it was not. For the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. So he paints you a picture. How many of you had some time in abstinence? Either you failed to develop your spiritual life, or you didn't even know that was possible, or you did whatever you thought you were supposed to do. And when you started up again, it didn't only get bad, it got bad quick. That's what it means to go off like a ski jump. Like you had your feet on the ground and then you don't. And the ground is moving away from your feet. Yeah? Has that ever had that experience? Okay. So after a time, I returned to the hospital. So now we're on treatment 2. Treatment 2. How many of you felt bad because of a relapse? Came back and felt a little diminished. So the author of this book would like for you to know that sometimes it takes a minute to grasp the depth of our situation. Because until I know I'm sick, I don't seek a healer. Okay? So this was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain perhaps within a year. She'd soon have to give me over to the undertaker of the asylum. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. You ever get to that point? Go to enough treatments, enough detoxes when they come and tell you, man, you're dying. So yeah, tell me when. Dying, I know. It's the timing I'm confused about. Right? Okay. So he said it was a devastating blow to my pride. So he's talking about, this was a war hero. This is a guy that was a big business guy. This guy had proven over and over again that he was an overcomer, but he knew he was not overcoming this obstacle. How many of you had that experience? So that's what he's talking about. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before. How many of you had a whole line of people in your mind who a real alcoholic or a real addict was? And at least I'm not that bad yet. And one by one, we started attending their funerals. At least I'm not that bad yet. It's not even funny after a while, is it? Because we feel like we're just walking around dead, yeah? Okay. So I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. Bill describes the one time in the depth of his addiction that he turns his thought to somebody else. I suggest if you look back in your story, you'll see a time in the depths of your addiction you turned your thought to someone else. When it happens, a window opens into our consciousness and power comes in. And sometime shortly after that, something happens in us. I wanted to call to your attention his recollection of that so you can, that's why we do the steps, to arm ourselves with facts about ourselves, so when we bear witness, we can tell people what happened, right? How many of you know why I'm going to this much detail? How many of you used every day no matter what, pretty much? They didn't lock you up or tie you down, and then one day you didn't. How'd that happen? Got no idea. Got no idea, right? So the fact of the matter is something changed, and I didn't change it. So we're starting to think differently about a power greater than ourselves in an encounter and how that might have occurred in our story. Yeah? You'll hear people in the rooms talk about how I was struck sober. Okay? So this is that part of the story that he's telling you about. So he goes on to tell you that no words can tell the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. So he finally owned, guys, we don't ask you to believe in God. That's a further step. We ask you to believe in power and first concede that alcohol is your master. Come to believe in an illness, then you'll understand the need for a healing. Does that make sense? Okay. So I had met my match. I'd been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. So how many of you had some sobriety based on fear for a little while? It's not safe. Keep that shit away from me. Huh? We laugh, but all of us have had that thought too, right? I'm going to pour it all. How many of you poured it all out and then had to go to the store in the same 24-hour period? Okay, so we know, right? Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of the first drink. Did you catch that? Insidious insanity of the first drink. The insanity begins before the drink. What happens after the drink is the crazy shit that happens to guys like me after I drink. Got nothing to do with the insanity of alcoholism. The insanity of alcoholism is an appalling lack of perspective that allows me to take a drink knowing what's likely to happen. It isn't doing the same thing expecting a different result. It's doing the same thing knowing the fucking result, doing it anyway. Do you understand? Okay. So, on Armistice Day, 1934, I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was to be the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. So how many of you don't quite know what that means, but as addicts kind of like the idea of being catapulted? We always kind of want to be launched, yeah? So he's talking about a fourth dimension of existence. At the time, we're talking about, added dimensions beyond time and, the normal dimensions. We start talking about time and space. And if we're beyond those dimensions, right, if there's no time, then there's only now. And if there's no space, then it's right here. And so when you're in this place of here and now, sometimes life's more manageable. So he tells us a little more about it. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. So what he's telling you is what he sought in the world from synthetic spirits and other worldly experiences, he found in a recovered state, a progressive recovery where he came to know power, peace, usefulness. Does that make sense? In a way of life. Does that make sense? Okay. So near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. Any of you ever found yourself just sitting drinking by yourself? Did you have enough hidden that you could keep it up for a while? Okay. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. That's really a warm feeling, isn't it? I'm not going to have to go anywhere for 24 hours. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide the full bottle near the head of the bed. I would need it before daylight. Any of you live with people you had to hide it from? If you guys don't know drinkers are hiders. Meth addicts, you guys are hiders too. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. I call your attention, if you're looking in the book, that's in italics. That took an extra effort when they published in that day. They had to reset the type. So they wanted you to understand how miraculous it was. Bill and his friend Ebby, as bad as Bill got, the one guy that at least I'm not that bad yet, that's Ebby. Like, at least I'm not as bad as that drunk. That's who this guy is to him. So he wants you got to get how amazed he is to hear from Ebby and to hear that Ebby can talk straight. Like we all know the guy that calls all the time and you know they're drinking because although they think they're very eloquent, they sound like they've got the fucking receiver in their mouth. Okay. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. What condition? So Cat doesn't show up here sober, right? Okay. I was amazed. You got to get it, man. He's really emphasized. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he'd been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he'd escaped. See, it wasn't enough that something happened and now he's well. This cat had to have busted out. And if you don't get that part of the story, you don't understand what a miracle it is later in the story when he tells what happened. Right? So, of course, he'd have dinner, and then I would drink openly with him, unmindful of his welfare. I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. How many of you got an opportunity in that dreary desert of futility, and you did have enough, and someone came by that wasn't going to judge you for how much you knew you were going to use, and you had enough to share? And it's like, party, right? This is good shit. This is going to be good. So there was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. The very thing an oasis. Drinkers are like that. So I set the story up so you could see yourself there, and you can, an oasis conjures what? It's quite often a mirage, right? Right? Quite often what we think is an oasis in the old movies is not, and they're drinking sand, right? But every once in a while, it's a water hole out in the middle of the desert, right? Okay. So the door opened and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. Now ponder those words. This is a man describing his drinking buddy as fresh-skinned and glowing. That's weird, right? So something had to be very different. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? So now he's inward, right? He's got to go inward. We're starting to learn. Eyesight without insight is spiritual blindness. So if I don't understand what I'm seeing, go inward and ask what I'm seeing. Okay? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed, but curious, I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. How many of you have been disappointed but curious? Why aren't you drinking? Does my wife know you're here? There's got to be something shady going on, right? Okay. Come, what's all this about? I queried. He looked straight at me, simply but smilingly. He said, I've got religion. Now, I felt some of you lose just... No matter what your particular belief system, if you're sitting there drunk and drinking, and you're expecting your old drinking buddy to come and tear it up, and you ask how they're doing, and they say, I've got religion, the fun meter goes... This is going to suck, right? Okay. So that's where we're at. That's where we're at. Fresh-skinned and glowing to, oh, fuck. Right? Okay. I was aghast, so that was it. Last night, an alcoholic crackpot, or last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire all right, but bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. So, okay, I regather myself, and I can drink my way through this unpleasant time. Really? More for me. Yeah? Okay? But he did no ranting. Disturbance number 2. He's just told me he's religious, and he's not acting religious. And now that's really disturbing. Anyone relate what I'm talking about? I had an expectation of what he was going to be, and he's not that. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how 2 men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. Guys, I don't know when we started lying to people and said we don't, I'm spiritual, not religious. Dude, we have a religious idea. God dwells in you. And a practical program of action that will prove that fact to you through you. And that's all we got. If lack of power is your dilemma, we're going to introduce you to power. That's it. That's all we got. That's the program. Now, you may go to the rooms and hear all kinds of opinions. I think they're going to come out with a second issue of the big book, and it's going to be called the Book of Opinions. You can give it a shot. I don't know when it's going to be published exactly. So that was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. He had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. Notice how he didn't come to pass a meeting list on. He didn't come to pass a reading on. He came to share an experience with him. And he had already had the experience before he asked, because He was inexplicably different. He stood there fresh, thin, and glowing. He already went inward to say, what are you showing me, before he even knew what he was asking to see or who he was asking, right? So it says, I had to be, for I was hopeless. He talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays way over there on the hillside. There was that proffered temperance pledge I never signed, my grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk and their doings, and his insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past, and they made me swallow hard. Now he's talking about having reflected that revelatory spirit came on him. People he deeply respected had deep faith, and they said, I'm not going to let them tell me how to read my book or how to worship my God. I'm good. And when he thought of that even to death. He said, don't tell me your religious idea about the God I know. It made him swallow hard. Any of you had such a profound experience that it forced an emotional response in you? Okay, so that's where we know God's an experience and not a concept. The subject of my experience, not the object of my belief. And that's important to understand, because once Bill's had this encounter, he still had to go to another detox. He still had to go a little more time. But now he's had these profound experiences, which leads him to this manner of living, which he witnesses to. Yes? Okay. So he talks about the wartime day in the old Winchester Cathedral. So he's talking about before he went to war. So get that. He went to war. He's in a graveyard in England before he goes across the channel, and he's scared. And he had always been a bit agnostic, but he knew right then he was frightened, and he was staring at a gravestone of an old soldier who had survived war and drank himself to death, and he prayed to what he didn't understand, and the Spirit came on him. And then he said it was fleeting and soon lost and left. So the reason this was so important is he remembered that before he went to war. Now he's a soldier who survived war. He's drinking himself to death, and pow, the power's there again. Tangibly. See what he's witnessing to? Notice how that has depth and weight? Because that's not coming from up here. What you're feeling is happening in you. From a book written 80 years ago. Okay. So I'm going to jump over from there to the middle of the next page, 11. And it says, but my friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. So the step on the wall says we admitted, but the first step in recovery is that we learned we had to fully concede to our innermost self. And so what he's telling you is admission isn't what it is. There's a description of what to do, and then there's an experience when it's happened. Does that make sense? I can't fully concede to myself based on a lie. So that there was a profound change that came over me to admit defeat, but I could say it. Well, of course I drink this way. I'm an alcoholic. Until I knew what it meant. Until I was a dead man walking and couldn't seem to get dead. Yeah? Okay. Then he had in fact been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from a scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he'd ever known. There's your description of what it is to be recovered. Taken from a scrap heap and raised to a level of life better than the best I've ever known. Doesn't mean it got ducky right away. It means I got free of me in that instant, and I no longer had those limiting thoughts about me that kept me from moving forward all those years. My circumstances didn't change. My perspective shifted in an instant. Make sense? We're going to run out of time, so hang on. Had this power originated in him? Inward. He had to get honest with himself, didn't he? Dude, if I had the power to stop this, I'd have done it before the house got taken over by the mortgage holder. I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. Really? Was that before or after the 10 years you spent on the inside? Give me a fucking break. The power didn't originate in him. Okay? Obviously, it did not. Right? He got honest with himself. There'd been no more power in him than there was in me at that minute, and this was none at all. So he's seen Ebby has gained access to power, but he knows Ebby had no more power than Bill, who's drunk and drinking. So something's happened. So what he's telling me must be true, even if he doesn't tell it to be right. Because his presence is self-evident. Does that make sense? That's why alcoholics go out and carry a message to an alcoholic, and we can win their confidence when others fail, because the one thing we know that medical people don't know is the depth of our sadness and despair. And no one knows how to carry it like one of us who's born it, and we can help them walk out of that. Right? We can win their confidence. Okay. So it says, that floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. Ay, ay, ay. I haven't been overly kind to them. Right? Hey, we're still not, right? We see where they're right. Do you know we have a language in recovery, and they have a language in the religious communities, and you know we're talking about the same power? We just don't talk in the same language, which is why depth and weight helps, because the Spirit speaks for us, right? You may not know who I am or what I'm saying, but I don't have to say anything with the signet ring of the Spirit, because you'll know whose I am, even if you don't know who I am. Got me? So next week we'll look at all the rest of the steps, but thanks for hanging with me, man. We're good.